All right, hello everybody. Welcome to section 2. In this section, we're going to be exploring terrorism in various regions of the world. The first section we talked about characteristics of terrorism, what terrorism is, all those kinds of things. So in this section, we're going to be talking more about actual places, where terrorism is occurring and the kinds of terrorism that's going on there. Another change, with it being section 2 now. The first section we had pretty much just discussion boards every week. So this section we're going to do something different. We're going to have what I call terrorism event assignments. Details for those assignments are in the syllabus and they're on Blackboard, but essentially you're going to find a terrorist event from whatever region it is that we're talking about, and then write a short paper about characteristics of it and that sort of thing. But make sure you read about exactly what I want in those papers in the syllabus or on Blackboard, and then those need to be submitted as attached Microsoft Word documents in Blackboard. There's a spot for them in the folder for that week. So the first region we're going to talk about is Israel, Lebanon, and Palestine. Now, anyone who is somewhat familiar with this region knows there's been unrest in this part of the world for literally forever. Go all the way back to biblical times. So there really isn't any good way to really dig into the issues here in these videos that I do. Because we're talking 15, 20 minutes. There's entire volumes of books written about what's going on over there and what has been going on over there. So I'm going to try to do this at about 15 minutes or so. So it's going to be kind of a real kind of quick hitter on what's going on over there. So be sure you read the section, the chapter in the book. There's lots of really good information in there. And it really does a good job of kind of setting things up and showing you how everything came about. They also do a pretty good job discussing issues from both viewpoints. All right, so where do we begin? The book starts talking about geography and demographics and stuff. I'm not going to spend any time on that. You can read that in the book. I'd rather spend our time more discussing what is happening there and why. So just like the book, I'll start with the Israeli narrative of what's going on. Because as I'm sure you also know, if you've paid any attention to what's going on over there, you have two different stories, right? You have the Israeli story and the Palestinian story. And obviously they're both in the same place, but there's two different stories and two different sides to this issue. So if we talk about the Israeli narrative, the Israeli claim to the land they possess reaches all the way back to the biblical dates. They believe that the land that they now occupy was promised to them in the Bible by God. In the Bible, however, it doesn't really give exact boundaries of what they were supposed to possess, so that part of it is fairly uncertain. But if you go back through history, all the way back to biblical times, the Jewish population in that area has been subjected to persecution, slaughter, subjugation at the hands of various empires, starting with the Romans. Despite all this, they've endured. And then in the 1870s, a movement started in Russia, and it was known as the Zionist movement. And basically the Zionist movement stated that the Jewish people were a nation just like anybody else, and they should have their own single homeland, and that homeland should be in Palestine. So it started just kind of a grassroots kind of thing, and then it started picking up steam. And then an event called the Dreyfus Affair happened. And I won't go into all that, but what it essentially did is it led the British government to starting to help facilitate Jewish settlers into Palestine. And kind of around that same time, there were already efforts underway to get Jewish people moved and settled into Palestine. And by about 1914, the Jewish population was about 375,000 people. However, as Britain found, the area was difficult to govern, and there were several acts of violence by the Arab population in Palestine throughout the 1920s and then again in the 1930s. And then in 1937, the Palestine Royal Commission report recommended that there should be a two-state solution in Israel, which you still hear talked about today. Should there be a two-state solution in Israel? All the way back in 1937, they were already talking about that. However, the British government rejected the idea. Basically, they said it'd be too hard to implement and couldn't be done. Well, and then here comes World War II. All right, so now World War II is starting, and remember now, this is British-controlled part of the world at the time. So the Jewish inhabitants of the area joined the British in fighting the war, but then felt betrayed when the British then signaled that they were wanting to improve the living standards of the Arab population in Palestine. So that made the Jewish people mad because they felt like, well, we just helped you fight a war, and now you're trying to help these people that we don't think really did anything to help you at all. So that's where we start having terror groups kind of coming into the picture. But the focus of the terror groups was on the British occupiers. It wasn't on the Jews or the Palestinians or the Arabs. It was the British occupying forces. So then finally, in 1947, the newly formed United Nations voted to create or implement this two-state solution. So you have one state that's Israeli and one state that's Arab. Israel declared independence in 1948, and then quickly had to fight a war against Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Jordan. Israel won that war and added quite a bit more land to their area. But the borders that they came up with weren't really defensible. Like, they didn't have defensible borders. They had this new land that they had acquired through this war, but it really wasn't defensible. So then they had to fight another war in 1967, which was called the Six-Day War, and Israel handily won that war. And that allowed them to set up defensible borders for their country. Then in 1973, they would fight another war called the Yom Kippur War. In this war, Israel did not win decisively, but they also didn't lose. So then in 1979, Israel and Egypt signed a peace treaty. And there was quite a bit of protests, from that, and a lot of people unhappy about Egypt signing this peace treaty with Israel. Israel then had to invade Lebanon in 1982 because they were getting bombarded by Palestinian attacks from southern Lebanon. So they invaded Lebanon in 1982, and they remained there until the year 2000. All right, so that's just kind of a real quick. Obviously, there was lots more, that kind of happened through all of that. Quite a few other violent events and periods in Israel's past, and presently, Israel continues to be the target of terrorist groups, and also from some of their neighboring countries. All right, so now the Palestinian narrative. There's really two main groups that we need to talk about when it comes to the Palestinian narrative: Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas is actually located in Palestine. And they've existed since the late 1970s. And it's interesting that originally Israel supported the growth of Hamas to counteract another group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And we'll talk more about the PLO here in a little bit. Hamas does a lot of social and community stuff. They're involved in social and community issues. But they make no bones about their desires, that they're very explicitly anti-Israel, including a phrase that they have that they want to establish an Islamic theocracy in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, and they pretty much reject any compromise. And you can read the exact wording of it in the book. Twice now, Israel has killed the leader of Hamas, but like what happens a lot of times, with these groups, killing the leader didn't eliminate the group, and they actually became more influential and got to where they were acting as a shadow government, and they were providing various services to the people, like healthcare, education, other kinds of social programs, and they continued to attack Israel, even though twice Israel has killed their leader. All right, so Hezbollah. Hezbollah is located in Lebanon. All right, Lebanon became its own country and gained independence in 1943. And like a lot of places in the Middle East, there was unrest almost from the beginning, from the time they gained independence. And then the Civil War broke out in 1975 and continued until the early 1990s. The Civil War was fought by various factions because the government was really weak, the military was really weak, so you basically had militias fighting each other, and at times it was Muslims versus Christians. So finally in 1990, and they were basically fighting over the fact that when they set up the Lebanese parliament, when they first started, they used the census from 1932 because that was the last one that had been taken, and Lebanon at the time was a majority Christian country. Well, by the time 1943 rolled around, that wasn't necessarily the case. So seats were apportioned based on Muslim versus Christian. So they didn't feel like it was fairly apportioned. So in 1990, they redid all that and apportioned an equal number of Christian and Muslim seats in the parliament, and that ended the Civil War. They also pardoned people for almost all political crimes that were committed prior to that time. Now, there were some high crimes that they did not, but for a lot of political crimes, they just pardoned everybody and kind of said, let's just start over, more or less. Israel has invaded Lebanon twice, 1978 and 1982, and then didn't leave until 2000. And they've also had other armed conflicts there as well. But because of the Israeli incursions into Lebanon, a group called Hezbollah formed in 1975. Hezbollah's main thing is that they view Israel as an occupier and oppressor of Lebanon, which sounds very similar to what Hamas views, but Hamas views them as such for Palestine. It's really interesting about Hezbollah because there's really very little Israeli influence in Lebanon right now. They only have a little bitty piece of ground, but Hezbollah still views them that way. Hezbollah has been very successful. They're very influential in the politics of Lebanon, and Hezbollah actually probably poses a more severe threat to the United States and the West than does Hamas, because Hezbollah is much more active in international crime, drug smuggling, things like that. All right, so let's go back to Palestine now. You remember I said the Israelis believe that the Bible gives them rights to their property. Well, here's the rub now, that the Palestinians also claim that. Okay, the Palestinians also claim the Bible gives them claim to the land that Israel occupies, because according to them, their ancestors predate the Israeli claims to the area. In the Bible, it talks about how the Israelis are supposed to take the land from different tribes. Well, the Palestinians claim that they're that tribe that the Israelis are supposed to take it from, and they never did it, so that they actually predate the Israeli claim to the land. So their claim is that according to the Bible, it's actually their land and not the Israeli land. So remember the UN resolution that I talked about a couple seconds ago. Okay, Israel accepted the two-state solution by the UN. The Palestinians did not. Okay, the Palestinians did not accept that UN resolution that gave the two-state solution and gave Israel some land, because they claimed that the UN had really no right to be able to do that, or no power to give away their land. So to make matters worse, after that, Palestinians became angry with neighboring countries for not welcoming their refugees, and then the Arab nations were angry about what was going on. So everybody was kind of angry at everybody at that time. And then, so in the aftermath of all this, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed, or the PLO was formed in 1965, and the goal of this organization was to eliminate Israel, and then they also established the Palestinian Liberation Army. And Yasser Arafat, not too long after this, took over the PLO. And Yasser Arafat is going to be involved in politics and politics in Palestine for many, many years. All right, so then in about 1970, an event called Black September happened, where Palestinians hijacked and destroyed some airliners, some Jordanian airliners, and then they were attacked by Jordan, and Syria got into the fray. So this spawned another group called Black September. And after that, the PLO then moved back into Lebanon in 1974, just in time for their civil war, so they could join the fighting. Well, eventually, the PLO was expelled from Lebanon. And then after that, there were a couple of Palestinian uprisings, and that continued. The fighting kind of continued off and on until the Oslo Accords in 1993. Yasser Arafat, meanwhile, is gaining more and more power, and he ended up being around until about the year 2000. He was the leader of various groups. He had various government positions. He was very, very influential in Palestinian government throughout that time. And then he ended up dying in about 2004. And after he died, in an attempt to try to gain some peace, Israel planned to disengage from the Gaza Strip and pull out from 4 other West Bank settlements. And it worked somewhat. Hamas then won parliamentary elections in 2006, and anybody that was paying attention to what was going on in the world at that time may remember how surprised everybody was. I mean, the United States was flabbergasted that Hamas was able to gain that kind of power in Gaza. So they won quite a few parliamentary elections in 2006. So then there was some more fighting in Gaza after Hamas won. Israel was fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israel put economic sanctions on Gaza. So then a new prime minister came on the scene in Gaza, and he tried to kick out all the Hamas members out of the parliament. So Israel then removed the economic sanctions. A new Palestinian government was formed in the West Bank. But again, it didn't end all the violence. Israel continued to suffer rocket attacks from Gaza. Then Israel responded by invading the West Bank. And then they were there until they left in about 2009. In 2008, an agreement was reached between Israel and Palestine where they kind of traded ground. Palestine allowed Israel to have certain ground, but then Israel had to agree to give up different ground. So they did reach some agreements on some of that. Hamas signed a reconciliation deal with Fatah, and they agreed to work toward a unified government. So since that time, things obviously haven't been perfect in Israel, and they still continue to suffer rocket attacks at the hands of Hamas and Hezbollah. But things have been fairly peaceful since then. There hasn't been any big incursions. There haven't been, any of these large-scale kind of military engagements. So things have moved somewhat in the right direction, towards some kind of peaceful agreement between Israel and Palestine. But as you can probably tell from just the short little bit that I talked about, and then once you read in the book, obviously that can change in a heartbeat over there. All right, so that's just kind of a real quick kind of discussion about what's in the book this week. There's a lot more information in the actual chapter, and it much more clearly defines, what's going on and what's been going on there, and all different sides and all of that. So please make sure you read the rest of the stuff in the book. There's 2 articles at the end. Please read those as well. And then complete your terrorist event assignment. And let me know if you have any questions. And I'll see you next week.